So let's begin. The prisoner's dilemma scenario is characterized by the following features. There's two players. They have the option to cooperate, that is, cooperate with one another, or defect, that is, turn on one another. And the incentives in this game are such that the payoffs in this game are such that they are driven inevitably to arrive at this defect solution, which is suboptimal from the standpoint of their mutual best interest, right? They'd like to end up here, but the incentives are such that they end up here, turning on one another. The prisoner's dilemma scenario is important from an ethical perspective because it's often the case, right? We talked about the idea that people who are ultimately not bad people might be driven by incentive structures to take actions that are considered bad actions, almost out of a kind of defensive posture, right? Because they know that others, they know the payoffs that others are facing as well, that others are facing the same payoffs they are, and that they have an incentive to turn on them. So when everybody faces this kind of a scenario, it can often lead to bad behavior, despite the fact that nobody wants that behavior to take place. That's the important point of bringing up prisoner's dilemma in a class like this, is that when we can avoid these kinds of situations, we can often produce vastly superior outcomes from an ethical perspective. So let's look at the prisoner's dilemma in some detail. The scenario is as follows. Two criminals rob a bank. They get away in their getaway car. They've got a big bag of money in the back seat. They're high-fiving, and the police officer pulls them over for a broken taillight. Noticing that they have a bag of money in the back of the car, he says, "I'm bringing you into the precinct." So they're taken to the precinct where it's made clear that it is the money from the bank, and the officers separate them. They're unable to communicate and say the following: "We've already got you for possession of stolen property. And if you turn on your partner and confess to the bank robbery, we'll let you go free." Both parties are offered this. And the problem in the prisoner's dilemma scenario is that no matter what, from the perspective of either partner, no matter what the other partner does, they have an incentive to turn on one another. So let's look at the payoffs in this game, right? Cooperate in this instance means that they don't turn on one another. They cooperate with one another. And as we saw, if they cooperate, right, neither of them turns on the other, they will end up in a situation where they go to jail for 1 year for possession of stolen property. Now, if player one were to defect, that is, turn on player two, and player two were to continue cooperating, right? Player one would walk out of the precinct a free person, and player two would go to jail for bank robbery for 6 years. And the same situation plays out in reverse. The fourth possible outcome, and the one at which they're sort of inevitably driven to arrive, is that they both turn on one another. They are, in that instance, both assigned 3 years in prison. They both are effectively pleading guilty to the crime, and so they serve 3 years in prison each. So another way, right? No snitching, CC, no snitching. Each goes to prison for possession of stolen property, or they snitch and avoid jail while the other goes to prison for 6 years, or both snitch and each goes to prison for 3 years for bank robbery. And the way to analyze this scenario in this matrix form is the following. You look at each case and you try to determine what one player would do given the choice of another. So we ask the following: if player one chooses to cooperate, is it in player two's best interest to cooperate or defect? Remember, these are years in prison. Well, the answer is clear. It's in player two's best interest to defect. Right? And then we ask, if player one chooses to defect, is it in player two's best interest to cooperate or defect? If they cooperate, they'll go to jail for 6 years. If they defect, they'll go to jail for only 3 years. So once again, you see it's in their best interest to defect, right? You could also represent it with some little arrows. Now, we do the same for player 1. If player 2 chooses to cooperate, is it in player 1's best interest to cooperate or defect? Once again, we see it's in their best interest to defect. And if player 2 chooses to defect, is it in player 1's best interest to cooperate or defect? It is in player 1's best interest to defect. And so the players are driven inevitably to this outcome, defect, defect. And the question becomes, how could they avoid this situation? And the answer is, we have to do something to transform the payoffs. So let's look at what that something might be. This is the prisoner's dilemma with a violent mafia solution. So, right, the mafia has solved this problem. They've solved it through the exercise of violence. So we assume that those who snitch receive violent retribution from the mafia. Their arms and legs are broken, as are the close arms and legs of a close relative. And we assume that these damages are equivalent to serving 4 years in prison. It's like a really bad injury. Okay. And then, so here's the standard prisoner's dilemma, and here's the prisoner's dilemma when it's transformed, when we imagine that the payoffs have been transformed because of mafia intervention. So what happens? Instead of going to prison for 0 years, right, instead of walking away a free person, they walk out of that precinct and they immediately have their arms and legs broken, and one of their loved ones' arms and legs are broken as well. And that's equivalent to serving 4 years in prison. And the same is true in this instance. And then even if they both turn on one another, right, they don't only serve 3 years in prison. Because they've snitched, they have their arms and legs broken. So this completely transforms the game. And we can see that by just following the same steps that we followed in the previous example. If player 1 chooses to cooperate, is it in player 2's interest to cooperate or defect? Remember, these are years in prison. We see immediately it is now in player 2's interest to cooperate. And likewise, if player 1 chooses to defect, is it in player 2's interest to cooperate or defect? Once again, it's in player 2's interest to just go to jail for 6 years and not suffer the abuse that they will suffer for ratting out their friend. Okay, and so let's look at it again. If player 2 chooses to cooperate, is it in player 1's interest to cooperate or defect? The answer is cooperate. And if player 2 chooses to defect, is it in player 1's interest to cooperate or defect? Once again, it is to cooperate. And so the players are driven to the cooperative solution. So through the threat of violence, through the increased value for punishment for essentially bad behavior, defection, right? You've transformed the parameters of the game so that we arrive at the cooperate solution. So the mafia solved this problem. Now let's imagine a different kind of solution, the non-violent mafia solution. In this situation, we assume that those who choose not to switch are rewarded by the mafia, which takes care of their family while they serve time by paying them $250,000, right? So they're paying them a lump sum for not snitching. We assume that no punishment, right? And that is equivalent in this instance to having 4 years taken off of their prison sentence. It's not written there, but that's how it's been interpreted here. It's equivalent to having 4 years taken off of their prison sentence. So in the previous example, it was imposing punishment that was equivalent to having 4 years added to your prison sentence. In this case, the value of this is equivalent to having 4 years taken off of your prison sentence. If you don't think that's enough money, imagine it's more, okay? No punishment in this instance is imposed for snitching. As I said in class, the reality is that usually both of these things happen. You take care of the person who doesn't snitch and you punish the person who does. So let's walk through the scenario, right? Rather than serving 1 year in prison, they're serving the equivalent of -3 years in prison in this instance, right? They've been paid out a lump sum. They're happy to serve time if it means that they get paid out that sum. Likewise, rather than serving 6 years in prison, right? They're still going to serve 6 years time, but it's going to be equivalent to 2 years time from their perspective because they're going to be paid this lump sum, and the same is true here. And of course, they're not going to be paid anything if they snitch. They're just going to go to jail for 3 years. So let's see what happens here. Without any threat of violence, the scenario has been transformed. So we'll do the same thing we've done all along. If player 1 chooses to cooperate, is it in player 2's interest to cooperate or defect? And the answer in this case is, right, defect. -3 is less than 0. They'd rather take a year in prison with that lump sum than just walk out free. Same thing here. If they turn on one another, they'll go to jail. If player 1 chooses to defect, is it in player 2's interest to cooperate or defect? And again, they could go to jail for 3 years, or they could go to jail for 6 years and receive $250,000 equivalent to 4 years, taking 4 years off their sentence, right? And so from their standpoint, it's worthwhile. And as I said, if it's not enough money, make it more. Let's look at it this way. If player 2, pardon me, chooses to cooperate, is it in player 1's interest to cooperate or defect? Same story. And if, ooh, that's ugly. There we go. And if player 2 chooses to defect, is it in player 1's interest to cooperate or defect? Again, cooperate, okay. And so they're driven. And so we've now solved the prisoner's dilemma in the absence of violence. And in this case, instead of increasing the punishment for defection, we've increased the reward for cooperation. So I'm going to say that again. Instead of increasing the punishment for defection, we've increased the reward for cooperation. And in the process, we've solved the game. Now I'm going to move on, and I'm going to consider the case of the Pinto.